At 8:43 on the morning of September 19, 1944, Captain Jimmy Leach crouched in the cupola of his M4 Sherman tank 300 yards west of Aricourt, France, watching 8 Panther tanks emerge from the morning fog. The German column was moving at 15 miles per hour, turrets traversing slowly, searching for targets. Leach's company had 13 Shermans. All of them mounted the short-barreled 75mm gun, the kind of gun that couldn't penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at any range. Every tanker in Third Army knew the mathematics. A Panther could kill a Sherman from 2,000 meters. A Sherman could only penetrate a Panther's side armor, and only if it got close. Very close. Within 300 meters, preferably less. The official doctrine said withdraw and call for tank destroyers. Let the M18 Hellcats with their long 76mm guns handle German armor. That was the approved method. That was what kept you alive. Leach didn't withdraw. He gave the order to advance. 13 Shermans, guns blazing, straight toward 8 Panthers. In the next 11 minutes, his company would destroy or disable 5 of those German tanks while losing none of their own. It shouldn't have worked. According to every specification sheet, every armor penetration table, every comparative analysis the Ordnance Department had produced, the Panther was superior in every measurable way except one, and that one exception would change everything. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The M4 Sherman entered combat in North Africa in October 1942. It was designed as an infantry support weapon, not a tank killer. The 75mm M3 gun was chosen specifically for its high explosive capability. At 1,000 yards, it could penetrate 73mm of armor. That was adequate for the German tanks the army expected to face. The Panzer III, the early Panzer IV. In Tunisia and Sicily, the Sherman performed well. American tankers liked it. The tank was reliable, fast, and when it did meet German armor, it usually won. Then came Normandy. The Germans brought the Panther, 50 tons, sloped frontal armor, a high-velocity 75mm gun that could punch through 88mm of armor at 1,000 meters. The Panther's frontal glacis plate was 80mm thick at 55 degrees. Effective thickness, 140mm. The Sherman's 75 couldn't touch it, not at any range, not with standard ammunition. The math was brutal and unforgiving. The shell bounced off. Meanwhile, the Panther could kill the Sherman from ranges where the American tank couldn't even see the German vehicle clearly. The Tiger was worse. 56 tons, frontal armor, 100mm thick, 88mm gun that could destroy a Sherman from beyond 2,000 meters. But Tigers were rare. Only about 1,300 were built for the entire war. The real problem was the Panther. The Germans produced nearly 6,000 of them, and by the summer of 1944, they were becoming standard equipment in panzer divisions. American tank crews discovered this the hard way. On July 17, 1944, elements of the 2nd Armored Division engaged German forces near Saint-Lô. The unit reported hitting Panthers multiple times with 75mm armor-piercing rounds. The shells bounced off. The Panthers returned fire. American tanks burned. The engagement lasted 23 minutes. The 2nd Armored lost 9 Shermans destroyed and 4 more damaged. They claimed 2 Panthers knocked out, both from side shots at ranges under 400 meters. The pattern repeated across the front. American tanks hit German armor first, scored hits, watched the rounds ricochet, then died when the Germans returned fire. The kill ratio in these engagements was not good. In July 1944, First Army units reported that in direct tank versus tank combat, They were losing roughly 2 Shermans for every Panther destroyed. Against Tigers, the ratio was worse. Some units reported losing 4 tanks before achieving a single kill. The problem was obvious. The solution was not. The Army had 76mm armed Shermans available. The M4A1 with the 76mm M1 gun could penetrate a Panther's turret front at normal combat ranges. It still couldn't defeat the glacis plate, but it was better than the 75. The first 76mm Shermans arrived in England in April 1944. 130 tanks. A conference was held to determine allocation. None of the armoured division commanders wanted them. The reason was simple. The 76mm gun fired a smaller high-explosive shell than the 75. Against infantry, against anti-tank guns, against fortifications, the 75 was more effective. And in Normandy, American tanks spent most of their time fighting infantry and anti-tank guns, not other tanks. The bocage hedgerows made long-range tank combat impossible. Visibility was measured in yards, not meters. Engagement ranges were typically 150 to 400 yards. At those distances, the Panther's range advantage meant nothing, so the doctrine developed organically, passed from crew to crew, platoon to platoon. When you see German armour, you do one of 3 things. First option: withdraw and call for tank destroyers. Let the M18S or M10S handle it. Second option: call for artillery. Third option: if you have to engage, use combined arms. Infantry suppresses the German tank's supporting elements. Artillery pins it down. Then you maneuver for a flank shot. What you did not do, under any circumstances, was charge directly at superior German armour. That was suicide. Every tanker knew it. Every training manual confirmed it. The Sherman's advantages were speed and reliability. Use speed to avoid combat. Use maneuverability to get around. Use numbers to overwhelm. But never, ever, trade shots with a Panther at medium range. You would lose. Except they didn't always lose. And by late July 1944, some commanders were starting to notice a pattern in the after-action reports. The units that did worst against German armour were the ones that tried to engage at range. The units that did best were the ones that closed distance aggressively, not by choice, usually. The bocage forced them into close-range engagements. But the results were striking. At ranges under 300 metres, Sherman crews were winning more often than they lost. Operation Cobra launched on July 25, 1944. The breakout from Normandy. The 2nd Armoured Division spearheaded the assault on the right flank. They had been fighting German armour for 6 weeks. They had lost 70% of their tanks at one point, replaced them, kept fighting. By late July, they knew what worked and what didn't, and what worked was getting close. The 2nd Armoured had received some of the first M4A 176mm Shermans, 52 tanks. They deployed them during Cobra. But they didn't rely on the better gun. They relied on tactics. Wide encircling movements. One platoon engages frontally, draws fire. 2nd platoon flanks. At close range, the Sherman's advantages became apparent. Faster turret traverse. The Sherman could rotate its turret 360 degrees in 15 seconds. The Panther took 60 seconds. Stabilized gun. The Sherman had a gyrostabilizer that kept the gun on target while moving. The Panther didn't. Better crew coordination. Sherman crews trained together extensively. Many Panther crews in 1944 were inexperienced, thrown together from training depots and replacement battalions. And there was one more advantage that nobody had predicted. The Sherman's inferior frontal armour actually helped at close range. The lighter weight and lower centre of gravity made the tank more manoeuvrable in restricted terrain. It could navigate hedgerows, village streets, forest trails that the heavier German tanks couldn't use. In the bocage, that mattered more than armor thickness. Between July 26th and August 12th, 1944, one battalion of the 2nd Armored Division lost 51% of its personnel, killed or wounded, and 70% of its tanks destroyed or evacuated for repair. The casualties were appalling, but they were achieving their mission. They were destroying German armor. The kill ratio in close-range engagements was actually favorable. For every Sherman lost in combat with German tanks at ranges under 400 meters, American crews were, claiming 1.3 German tanks destroyed. That wasn't the ratio the newspapers reported. The newspapers talked about 5 Shermans to 1 Tiger. The myth was already spreading, but the myth was based on a misunderstanding of American doctrine. The Army planned to use 5 Shermans per heavy German tank not because it took 5 to kill 1, but because that was how tank platoons were organized. 4 tanks in the platoon, plus a command tank, 5 tanks total. The tactic was for one section to engage frontally while the other maneuvered. It was combined arms doctrine, not an admission of inferiority, but the myth took hold anyway. American tankers started to believe they were outclassed. Some units became cautious, defensive. They'd spot a Panther and immediately call for air support or artillery. They'd wait for the M18S to arrive. They'd withdraw to hull-down positions and hope the Germans didn't press the attack. And when they fought that way, defensively, their casualties increased. The Germans had the advantage in defensive combat. Better optics, better range, better armor. If you let a Panther fight at 2,000 meters, the Panther would win every time. The commanders who understood this started issuing new orders. Don't engage at range. Don't sit and trade shots. Close distance. Use terrain. Move fast. Keep the Germans off balance. Force them into close-range combat where Sherman advantages outweighed German ones. It wasn't official doctrine. It couldn't be. The Army ground forces would never approve tactics that involved charging superior enemy armor. But in the field, among the units actually fighting German tanks, the word spread. Captain Jimmy Leach learned it from Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams. Abrams commanded the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division. He was 29 years old, West Point graduate, aggressive to the point of recklessness. His battalion had fought across France from Normandy to the German border. They'd engaged Panthers, Tigers, Panzer IVs. They'd learned that hesitation killed you faster than aggression. When you saw German armor, you attacked, immediately. You closed distance before the Germans could use their range advantage. You got inside their decision loop. Abrams had a saying, "They've got better tanks, but we've got better tankers." It wasn't quite true. German crews weren't universally inferior. The veterans were excellent, but by September 1944, most German tank crews weren't veterans, they were replacements. Boys from training depots with 6 weeks of instruction. They knew how to drive and shoot, but they didn't know how to fight. American crews, by contrast, had been training together for months or years. They knew each other's voices. They anticipated each other's movements. In a fast-moving engagement at close range, crew cohesion mattered more than armor thickness. The 4th Armored Division proved this repeatedly. They'd raced, across France, as part of Patton's Third Army. By September, they'd reached Lorraine. The terrain there was different from Normandy. No hedgerows. Rolling hills, open fields, scattered forests, visibility extended to thousands of meters. Exactly the kind of ground where German tanks should dominate, where range and armor should decide the outcome. The 4th Armored had pushed across the Moselle River and established a bridgehead near the town of Aracourt. The position was exposed, a salient extending into German lines. Third Army wanted to use it as a springboard for the advance toward the Rhine, but first they had to hold it, and German 5th Panzer Army was coming to push them out. The German counterattack was supposed to be overwhelming. 2 panzer brigades, fresh from training, the 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades. Each brigade had 45 Panther tanks, 45 Panzer IVs, plus elements of 11th Panzer Division and 15th Panzer Grenadier Division. More than 260 German tanks and assault guns total, concentrated against a single American Combat Command, Combat Command A, 4th Armored Division, approximately 90 Shermans, most with 75mm guns. The Germans had local superiority of nearly 3-1. The Panthers were new, factory fresh, delivered directly to the brigades from production lines in Germany. The crews were inexperienced, but the tanks were as good as German industry could produce in September 1944. High-velocity guns, sloped armor, maximum speed of 28 miles per hour on roads. The German commanders expected to retake Lunéville and eliminate the American bridgehead within 48 hours. They didn't know they were about to encounter tankers who had learned that getting close to Panthers was better than staying away from them. The morning of September 18, 1944, began with fog. Heavy fog that reduced visibility to less than 100 meters across the Lorraine countryside. Combat Command A had established defensive positions around Aracourt the previous week. Colonel Bruce Clark commanded the unit. He was 42 years old, combat engineer by training, aggressive by temperament. He'd been with 4th Armored since Normandy. He knew his tankers, he knew his ground, and he knew the Germans were coming. Intelligence reports from 3rd Army indicated German armor concentrations east of the Moselle. Radio intercepts suggested a major counterattack was imminent. Clark positioned his forces in a thin defensive line using an extended outpost system. Armored infantry and engineers forward, supported by tanks in depth. Tank destroyer platoons positioned to cover likely German approach routes. Artillery registered on key terrain features. The 37th Tank Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, formed the Armoured Reserve. The 4th Armoured's Shermans were a mix of models. Most companies had M4A1S with 75mm guns. Some platoons had received M4A 176mm versions. A few had the newer M4A3 model with the improved Ford GAA engine. But regardless of model, the tactical doctrine was the same. When German armour appears, close distance immediately. Use terrain for cover, manoeuvre for flank shots. Never sit still and trade fire at range. The battalion commanders had drilled this into their crews for months. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams was particularly insistent. He'd seen too many tanks lost because crews hesitated. The Germans had better optics, better rangefinders, better armour. If you gave them time to set up, time to range your position, time to coordinate their fire, they'd kill you. But if you attacked immediately, if you moved fast and kept moving, if you forced them to make quick decisions under pressure, the advantages shifted to American crews. The training emphasized speed of action. Sherman crews practiced rapid target engagement. Gunner identifies target, announces range, fires within 3 seconds. Driver maintains movement at all times, unless specifically ordered to halt. Commander coordinates with other tanks in the platoon, ensures overlapping fields of fire. Loader keeps ammunition ready, cycles between armor-piercing and high-explosive based on target type. Every crew member had a specific role. Every role was practiced until it became automatic. The Sherman's stabilized gun was critical to this doctrine. The gyrostabilizer wasn't perfect. It only stabilized in the vertical plane, not horizontal. It couldn't keep the gun precisely on target at high speed over rough terrain. But it was good enough. At speeds up to 15 miles per hour over moderate terrain, a Sherman could maintain accuracy within an eighth of a degree. That translated to a 70% hit probability on enemy tanks at ranges between 300 and 1,000 meters while moving. The Panther had no stabilizer. German crews had to halt to fire accurately. That gave American tankers a critical window. If you were moving and the German was stationary, you could fire first. Your first shot might miss, but it would force the German crew to react. They'd button up, lose visibility, make rushed decisions. Meanwhile, you kept moving, kept shooting. Your second shot would be closer to target. Your third shot would be even better. By the time the German got his gun on you, you'd either killed him or closed distance to where his armor advantage didn't matter. The tactics worked best with multiple tanks operating together. A single Sherman attacking a Panther head-on was still at a disadvantage, but two Shermans working in coordination could overwhelm the German crew. One tank engages frontally, draws fire. Second, tank maneuvers for flank shot. The Panther's crew has to make a choice: engage the frontal threat or protect the flank. Either choice creates an opening. If they focus forward, the flanking tank kills them. If they turn to face the flanker, the frontal tank advances and gets a side shot. German doctrine in 1944 emphasized defensive tactics. Panthers were supposed to fight from prepared positions, using their range and armor to destroy attacking forces before they could close distance. But the doctrine assumed the Panthers would have time to prepare, time to dig in, to camouflage, to coordinate with supporting infantry and anti-tank guns. The doctrine didn't account for aggressive American tactics that forced immediate engagement at close range. The fog on September 18th negated every German advantage. You can't use superior optics when visibility is 100 meters. You can't leverage range when you can't see beyond 3 hedgerows. You can't coordinate defensive positions when you're advancing blindly through fog into unknown terrain. The German attack became a series of uncoordinated company-level thrusts, each one isolated, each one vulnerable. At 8 in the morning, company-sized elements of the 113th Panzer Brigade penetrated Combat Command A's outpost line on the east and south faces of the American salient. 2 American tank destroyer platoons and a Sherman company engaged immediately. The fighting became a running gun battle that extended all the way to Clark's headquarters area. At one point, a battalion of M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers engaged German armor with direct fire at ranges under 500 meters. 105mm howitzers weren't designed for anti-tank work, but at close range they could knock out any German vehicle with a single hit. The German tactical deployment was poor. The Panthers advanced in column formation on narrow roads, unable to maneuver due to the fog. When they encountered American positions, they couldn't deploy into line. They were forced to fight from the road, which exposed their side armor to any American tank that could get into flanking position. The fog that concealed the German advance also concealed American maneuver. Sherman platoons used farm tracks and forest trails to work around German flanks. At ranges under 300 meters, in heavy fog, the Panther's armor advantage disappeared. A 75mm armor-piercing round could penetrate a Panther's side armor at 200 meters. It could penetrate the rear armor at 400 meters. By noon on September 18th, the 113th Panzer Brigade had lost 11 tanks, destroyed or disabled. Combat Command A had lost 3 tank destroyers and 1 Sherman. The Germans withdrew to regroup. They hadn't expected this level of resistance. They hadn't expected American tanks to attack so aggressively. The doctrine said Americans avoided direct tank combat. The doctrine said they relied on air support and artillery. The doctrine was wrong. The fighting resumed on September 19th. The fog remained heavy until mid-morning. The Germans committed the 111th Panzer Brigade, pushing north toward Aracourt itself. This attack was better coordinated, multiple columns advancing simultaneously, but the Germans still lacked reconnaissance. The 5th Panzer Army had no organic cavalry or reconnaissance battalions. The panzer brigades were supposed to scout their own routes. In the fog, that was impossible. They advanced blindly, hoping to locate American positions through contact. Captain Jimmy Leach's B Company, 37th Tank Battalion, was positioned in reserve near Clark's headquarters when the call came. German armour advancing from the southeast. Unknown strength, company sized at minimum. Leach mounted his Sherman and moved his company forward at speed. 13 tanks, most with 75mm guns. Within minutes, they encountered the German column. 8 Panthers, moving in 2 columns of 4. Range, 300 yards. Visibility, improving as the fog began to lift. Leach didn't hesitate. He gave the order to advance, guns blazing. All 13 Shermans opened fire simultaneously while moving forward at 15 miles per hour. The doctrine was simple: create chaos, force the German crews to react before they could coordinate a response, overwhelm them with volume of fire, with speed of movement, with aggressive action. The lead German tank took 3 hits in the first 5 seconds. None of them penetrated the frontal armour. All of them struck the turret and hull with tremendous impact. Inside the Panther, the crew was stunned. The noise alone was disorienting. Steel on steel impact at high velocity sounds like a bell being struck with a sledgehammer. The tank doesn't penetrate, but the crew's concentration shatters. Training takes over. Button up. Identify targets. Return fire. But by the time they react, the situation has already changed. Leach split his company into 3 sections. 1st Platoon, under 1st Lieutenant Merwin Marston, moved directly down the Aracourt-Rechicourt road, engaging the Germans frontally. 2nd Platoon, commanded by Staff Sergeant James Baresi, swung south, looking for flank shots. 3rd Platoon remained in support position, ready to exploit any opening. The maneuver took 90 seconds. The Germans were still trying to deploy from column into line when Baresi's platoon hit their flank at 200 yards. 4 Panthers died in the next 3 minutes. Side armour penetrations at close range. The remaining Germans attempted to withdraw, putting their tanks into reverse, backing up while trying to keep frontal armour toward the threat. But they were on a road. They couldn't manoeuvre. Baresi's Shermans kept moving, working around to where the Panthers couldn't protect themselves. 2 more German tanks were disabled before the column broke entirely. The surviving Panthers fled at high speed, abandoning the battlefield. Leach's company held position for several hours, then pulled back to refuel and rearm. 13 Shermans had engaged, 8 Panthers at close range, and destroyed or disabled 5 of them without losing a single American tank. According to every comparative analysis, that outcome should have been impossible. The Panther was superior in armour, in gun penetration, in range. But the battle hadn't been fought at range. It had been fought at 200 to 300 yards, in fog, with aggressive manoeuvre. And at that range, with those tactics, the Sherman won. The pattern repeated across Combat Command A's sector throughout September 19th. German tank columns advanced into American positions. American crews attacked immediately, closing distance before the Germans could establish defensive positions. The Germans lost 43 tanks that day, mostly Panthers. Combat Command A lost 3 Shermans destroyed and 2 damaged. The kill ratio was more than 14 to 1. General George Patton visited Aracourt that evening. He found General John Wood, commander of 4th Armoured Division, and Colonel Clark discussing the next day's operations. Patton asked about casualties. Clark reported 6 men killed and 13 wounded. Patton asked about tank losses. Clark said 5 Shermans knocked out, 3 total losses. Patton asked about German losses. Clark said 43 tanks destroyed, most of them Panthers, factory new models. Patton was skeptical. 43 German tanks in one day sounded like an exaggeration, but the wreckage was visible across the battlefield. Knocked out Panthers still burning, abandoned Panzer IVs with penetration holes in the side armor. The evidence was undeniable. Patton ordered Clark to continue the attack the next morning, push towards Saragumines. The German counterattack appeared to have spent itself. Time to exploit. But the Germans weren't finished. 5th Panzer Army had more tanks available. The 11th Panzer Division was moving into position. Elements of 15th Panzer Grenadier Division were preparing to support. General Hasso, von Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army, had only taken command on September 1st. He was aggressive, experienced, determined to fulfill Hitler's order to eliminate the American bridgehead. The failure on September 19th just meant he needed to commit more forces. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. From September 20th through September 25th, 5th Panzer Army launched repeated attacks against the Aracourt salient. Each attack involved company or battalion-sized tank formations, supported by infantry and assault guns. Each attack encountered the same American response: immediate counterattack at close range, aggressive maneuver, combined arms coordination with tank destroyers and artillery. The Germans kept advancing into killing zones where their advantages didn't matter and their disadvantages became fatal. On September 20th, German Panthers moved toward Combat Command A's headquarters in force. Several American support units were pinned down by the German advance. The situation looked dangerous until Major Charles Carpenter arrived overhead in his L-4 Cub observation aircraft. Carpenter had armed his plane with bazookas, 6 bazooka tubes, 3 mounted under each wing. It was an unauthorized modification. The Army Air Forces would have forbidden it if they'd known in advance. But Carpenter had been using his armed plane for weeks, attacking German vehicles from the air with surprising success. The morning fog finally lifted around noon. Carpenter spotted a company of Panthers advancing toward Aracourt, approximately 15 tanks. He dove through German ground fire and made repeated attack runs, firing all 6 bazooka rockets at the German formation. He didn't destroy any tanks, but he didn't have to. The rockets exploding near the Panthers caused the German crews to button up, to halt, to lose situational awareness. By the time they recovered, American Shermans had arrived and were engaging at close range. The engagement lasted 40 minutes. American tanks destroyed 8 Panthers and damaged 3 more. The Germans withdrew. Combat Command A had held. Again, the pattern was becoming clear to both sides. German tanks advancing across open ground were vulnerable to close-range American counterattacks. The theoretical advantages of the Panther didn't translate to battlefield success when the Americans refused to fight at long range. German commanders adjusted their tactics. They started using more infantry support. They positioned Panthers in hull-down positions and waited for Americans to attack. They tried to create the defensive battle their doctrine assumed. But Combat Command A didn't cooperate. When Germans established defensive positions, American forces called for artillery and airstrikes. P-47 Thunderbolts from 19th Tactical Air Command attacked German armor with rockets and bombs. American artillery fired time-on-target missions that dropped hundreds of shells simultaneously on German positions. The Germans were forced to either abandon their positions or die in place. On September 25th, the Germans made their final major effort: 2 coordinated attacks against hills northeast of Aracourt, Hill 318 and Hill 265. The Germans committed Panthers, Panzer IVs, and assault guns in battalion strength. The attacks began in early morning fog. By mid-morning, the fog lifted, and American fighter bombers arrived, P-47 seconds, from the 405th Fighter Group, attacked the German formations in the open. The airstrikes destroyed 23 German tanks and forced the survivors to retreat into cover. In the afternoon, German forces attempted to retake Hill 318. American tank and artillery fire stopped them cold. The Germans lost additional tanks trying to withdraw. By evening, the counterattack had collapsed. 5th Panzer Army had committed its best units. The panzer brigades were exhausted, depleted, no longer combat effective. The German commanders requested permission to withdraw. Permission was denied. Hitler wanted the bridgehead eliminated. The attacks would continue. The fighting around Aracourt continued into early October, but the major German offensive ended on September 29th. 5th Panzer Army had lost approximately 200 tanks and assault guns destroyed or damaged beyond repair. The Americans lost 48 Shermans. The kill ratio was more than 4-1 in favor of Combat Command A, and most of those German tanks were Panthers, supposedly superior to the Sherman in every measurable way. The battle demonstrated something that doctrine didn't acknowledge. Tank combat wasn't determined solely by armor thickness and gun penetration. Crew training mattered. Tactical doctrine mattered. Aggressive initiative mattered. And in the specific conditions of the Western European theatre in 1944, those factors favored American tank crews who understood that closing distance with German armor was better than fighting at range. The myth of German tank superiority didn't die at Aracourt. It persisted through the rest of the war and into the post-war period. Memoirs written by American tankers often emphasized how much better German tanks were. Popular histories repeated the 5 Shermans to 1 Tiger ratio. The narrative became fixed. American tanks were inferior. American tankers won through numbers and air support, not through superior skill or doctrine. But the actual statistics told a different story. Throughout the campaign in Northwest Europe, from June 1944 to May 1945, American tank units achieved roughly even kill ratios against German armor in tank versus tank combat. When you isolated engagements where American crews initiated contact and closed distance, aggressively, the ratios favored Americans significantly. The problem was that many American units didn't fight that way. They followed defensive doctrine. They waited for tank destroyers. They tried to engage at range. And when they fought defensively, they lost. The units that did best were the ones that learned what 2nd Armored and 4th Armored already knew. Get close, move fast, attack immediately, force the Germans to react under pressure. At 300 meters or less, the Sherman's advantages outweighed the Panthers. Faster turret traverse, stabilized gun, better crew coordination, more reliable mechanical systems. The Sherman could fight while moving. The Panther had to stop to shoot accurately. That difference decided more battles than armor thickness ever did. The Battle of Aracourt ended on September 29, 1944. But the lessons learned there didn't spread as quickly as they should have. 3rd Army knew what 4th Armored had accomplished. The after-action reports were clear. Close-range aggressive tactics against German armor produced favorable results. But 3rd Army was one component of a much larger force, and not every commander drew the same conclusions from the same evidence. 1st Army continued to emphasize defensive tank tactics through October and November. Units were instructed to avoid direct engagement with German armor when possible. Call for tank destroyers. Call for air support. Establish defensive positions and let the Germans attack into prepared killing zones. The doctrine wasn't wrong, exactly. Defensive tactics worked when you had time to prepare. but they required the Germans to cooperate by attacking, and in the fall of 1944, German forces were increasingly defensive themselves. The problem became apparent in the Hurtgen forest. American units pushed east toward the Rhine through dense forest terrain. Visibility was limited. Movement was restricted to roads and trails. German forces established defensive positions with overlapping fields of fire. When American armor encountered German tanks, the engagements happened at short range in restricted terrain, exactly the conditions where Sherman advantages should have dominated. But many American units still fought defensively. They'd spot a panther, halt, call for support, wait. Meanwhile, the Germans reinforced. The opportunity to exploit initial contact with aggressive action was lost. 4th Armored Division didn't make that mistake. After Aracourt, they continued east as part of 3rd Army's advance. They fought through Lorraine into November, then into the Saar region. They encountered German armor repeatedly: Panthers, Panzer IVs, assault guns. Each time, the doctrine was the same: close distance immediately, attack with multiple tanks in coordination, use terrain for covered approaches, never sit still and trade shots. The results remained consistent. 4th Armored's tank battalions achieved kill ratios of 2-to-1 or better against German armor throughout the fall of 1944. They lost tanks, certainly. Combat in 1944 was brutal for tankers regardless of doctrine, but they lost fewer tanks than units that fought defensively, and they accomplished their missions faster, which meant less time exposed to enemy fire overall. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams's 37th Tank Battalion became legendary within 3rd Army. Abrams pushed his crews hard. He demanded aggressive action in every engagement. He personally led attacks from the front. His command tank, named Thunderbolt, was always at the spearhead. Other battalion commanders started copying his tactics. The aggressive doctrine spread through 3rd Army by example rather than by official orders. But official doctrine didn't change. Army Ground Forces headquarters still emphasized defensive tank tactics. The field manuals still said tanks should avoid direct combat with enemy armor. The training courses still taught that German tanks were superior and American tanks should fight from prepared positions. The disconnect between official doctrine and successful battlefield practice created confusion among replacement crews arriving in Europe through late 1944. New tankers showed up at replacement depots having been trained that Panthers were invincible from the front. They'd been told that engaging German armor at close range was suicide. They arrived at frontline units and found veterans who routinely charged Panthers at 300 yards and won. The veterans would explain the tactics: move fast, shoot while moving, close distance before the Germans can set up. The replacements would listen, but the training they'd received made them hesitant. Some adapted quickly. Others never fully embraced the aggressive doctrine. The ones who hesitated died more often. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 demonstrated both the effectiveness, the limitations of close-range tank tactics. German forces launched a major offensive through the Ardennes, catching American forces by surprise. The attack involved significant German armor, including Tiger IIs, the King Tiger, even more heavily armored than the Tiger I. At 70 tons, with frontal armor up to 180 millimeters thick, the Tiger II was essentially invulnerable to Sherman fire from the front at any range. But the Tiger II had the same weaknesses as the Tiger I and Panther, only amplified: slow turret traverse, no gun stabilization, poor mobility in restricted terrain, high fuel consumption, mechanical unreliability. And the Tiger II weighed so much that many bridges couldn't support it. German commanders had to plan routes carefully to avoid bridges that would collapse under 70 tons. American units that fought defensively during the Bulge suffered heavy casualties. Units that maintained aggressive tactics did better. 2nd Armored Division was rushed north to help stop the German advance. They arrived at the northern shoulder of the German penetration on December 24th. The weather was terrible. Snow, fog, limited visibility, exactly the conditions that negated German range advantages. 2nd Armored attacked immediately with the same tactics they'd developed in Normandy. Close-range engagements, multiple tanks working in coordination, used terrain for covered approaches. They encountered German armor throughout the battle, Panthers, Tiger IIs, Panzer IVs. Each engagement was fought at ranges under 500 meters, often much closer. 2nd Armored lost tanks, but they stopped the German advance. By early January 1945, the German offensive had collapsed. The statistics from the Bulge were instructive. American tank units lost approximately 2,000 tanks during the battle. German forces lost roughly 900 tanks and assault guns. That's better than 2-to-1 ratio in favor of the Germans. But when you isolated engagements where American forces initiated contact and attacked aggressively, the ratios reversed. Units that attacked lost fewer tanks than units that defended. The aggressive doctrine worked even in the worst conditions American tankers faced during the entire war. By February 1945, the lessons from Aracourt and the Bulge were finally being incorporated into official training. New tank crew training courses emphasized aggressive tactics, close with enemy armor. Use speed and maneuverability. Accept that you'll take hits, but trust your training and your crew. The 76mm Sherman was now standard in most units. The M4, A3E8, the Easy 8, arrived in significant numbers. It had improved suspension, wider tracks, better mobility. Combined with the 76mm gun, it was the best Sherman variant produced. But the war in Europe was nearly over. By March, American forces were across the Rhine. German resistance was collapsing. Tank versus tank combat became rare. Most German armor had been destroyed or abandoned due to fuel shortages. The final months of the war involved more infantry combat than armored combat. The lessons learned at Aracourt were validated but only partially implemented before they became less relevant. The technical reasons why close-range combat favored Sherman crews were analyzed extensively after the war. Army Ordnance conducted studies comparing Sherman and Panther performance under various conditions. The studies confirmed what tankers already knew from experience. At ranges beyond 1,000 meters, the Panther had decisive advantages: better gun, better armor, better optics. At ranges between 500 and 1,000 meters, the Panther still had significant advantages, though skilled Sherman crews could compete. At ranges below 500 meters, the advantages became marginal. Below 300 meters, Sherman advantages in traverse, speed, and gun. Stabilization became more important than Panther advantages in armor and penetration. The studies also examined crew performance under combat stress. Sherman crews could engage targets faster than Panther crews on average. From target identification to first round fired, Sherman crews averaged 14 seconds. Panther crews averaged 21 seconds. That 7-second difference was critical in close-range engagements. The tank that fired first had overwhelming advantage. Even if the first round didn't penetrate, it forced the enemy crew to react defensively. Button up, take cover, lose situational awareness. By the time they recovered, the second round was already incoming. The stabilized gun multiplied this advantage. A Sherman moving at 15 miles per hour could fire with acceptable accuracy. The gyrostabilizer kept the gun close enough to target that experienced gunners could hit at 300 meters while moving. The Panther had to halt to fire accurately. That created a tactical dilemma for German crews. If you halt to shoot, you become stationary target. If you keep moving, you can't hit anything. American crews didn't face that dilemma. They could move and shoot simultaneously. Crew training quality also showed up clearly in the post-war analysis. American tank crews trained together for an average of 8 months before deploying to combat. The training emphasized crew coordination. Every member knew every other member's job. If the gunner was wounded, the loader could take over. If the driver was incapacitated, the co-driver could drive. The training created crews that functioned as integrated teams. German tank crews in 1944 didn't have that advantage. Veteran crews from 1942 and 43 were excellent, but casualties had depleted the veteran pool. Replacement crews received 6 to 8 weeks of training, often less. They were taught individual skills, how to drive, how to load, how to aim, but they didn't train as integrated crews for extended periods. When combat demanded fast, coordinated action, the lack of crew cohesion showed. The post-war analysis also examined why aggressive tactics hadn't been adopted earlier. The answer was institutional inertia. Army Ground Forces doctrine emphasized defensive operations because that's what the manuals taught. The manuals were written before anyone had combat experience against panthers and tigers. Once written, doctrine was difficult to change. Field modifications to doctrine required approval from headquarters. Headquarters required statistical proof that the modifications worked. By the time enough statistics accumulated to prove the point, most of the war was over. Individual commanders could deviate from doctrine based on their own judgment. That's what Creighton Abrams did. That's what Bruce Clark did. But individual deviation didn't change institutional doctrine. Other commanders followed the manuals. Their units suffered higher casualties and achieved less success, but the manuals said they were following proper procedures. The Army's institutional structure made it difficult to rapidly incorporate battlefield lessons into official training and doctrine. The British faced similar challenges. The Sherman Firefly, the Sherman mounting the 17-pounder gun, was the best Allied tank killer in the European theatre. It could penetrate a Panther's frontal armour at 1,500 metres. It could kill a Tiger I from 1,900 metres. But British doctrine treated the Firefly as a defensive weapon. Fireflies were distributed 1 per troop of 4 Shermans. They were supposed to provide overwatch while the 75mm Shermans manoeuvred. The doctrine was sound for defensive operations but limited the Firefly's offensive potential. British crews who used Fireflies aggressively achieved remarkable results. On one occasion in Normandy, a single Firefly destroyed 3 Tigers in 12 minutes, with 5 rounds total. The engagement happened at ranges between 800 and 1,200 metres. The Firefly could penetrate Tiger armour at those ranges. The Tigers couldn't effectively return fire because the Firefly was moving between shots, using terrain for cover, never presenting a stationary target. Aggressive tactics, combined with superior gun, made the Firefly extremely effective, but not all British units employed Fireflies that way. Many kept them in reserve, used them defensively, and lost opportunities to exploit their capabilities. The soldiers who fought with Shermans had mixed opinions about the tank. Some loved it, reliable, easy to maintain, comfortable for a combat vehicle. Others hated it, called it a death trap, a Ronson lighter that burned after every hit. The truth was more complex. Early model Shermans with wet ammunition storage did catch fire frequently when penetrated. The 75mm rounds were stored vertically around the turret ring. When an armour-piercing round penetrated the tank, it often hit the ammunition storage. The resulting fire killed the crew. Later model Shermans moved ammunition storage to the floor and surrounded it with water jackets. Wet ammunition storage reduced fire probability significantly. A Sherman with wet stowage that was penetrated had roughly 30% chance of catching fire. That was still higher than German tanks, but much better than the 70 to 80% rate for early models. Crews in later model Shermans had reasonable survival rates even when their tank was knocked out. The perception that Shermans burned easily persisted anyway. Part of it was psychological. When a Sherman burned, it burned dramatically. Gasoline fires are spectacular. The whole tank could be engulfed in flames within seconds. German tanks used diesel fuel, which burned less dramatically. When a Panther was knocked out, it might burn, but the fire was slower, less visible. The psychological impact of seeing Shermans burn colored how tankers perceived their vehicle's vulnerability. James Leach survived the war. He commanded B Company, 37th Tank Battalion through the liberation of France, the Battle of the Bulge, and the final drive into Germany. His company fought in dozens of engagements against German armor. They lost tanks. Men died. But they accomplished every mission assigned to them. Leach received the Silver Star for actions at Aracourt. The citation mentioned engaging superior enemy armor at close range and destroying multiple enemy tanks. It didn't mention that his tactics violated official doctrine. Creighton Abrams became one of the Army's most respected armor commanders. After the war, he remained in the service. He fought in Korea, commanded in Vietnam, eventually became Chief of Staff of the Army. His aggressive leadership style influenced a generation of armor officers. The M1 Abrams main battle tank, introduced in the 1980s, was named in his honor. The tank incorporated many of the lessons Abrams had learned fighting Panthers in 1944: speed, mobility, crew coordination, aggressive tactics. Bruce Clark retired as a 4-star general. He commanded in Korea, held various staff positions, eventually became Commander-in-Chief of U.S. Army Europe. His defense of Aracourt was studied in military schools for decades. The battle demonstrated that inferior equipment didn't determine outcomes when superior tactics and leadership were applied. Clark's decision to counterattack aggressively rather than defend passively was cited as an example of sound tactical judgment. 4th Armored Division ended the war with a combat record few other divisions could match. They'd been in combat for 11 months. They'd advanced farther and faster than any other American armored division in Europe. They'd captured over 80,000 prisoners and destroyed hundreds of German tanks and assault guns. Their casualty rate was actually lower than many infantry divisions, despite being at the spearhead of Third Army's advance. Aggressive tactics reduced casualties by reducing time spent in contact with enemy forces. The myth of German tank superiority persisted long after the war. Books written in the 50s and 60s emphasized how much better German tanks were. The Panther was described as the best tank of World War II. The Tiger was legendary. The Sherman was portrayed as barely adequate. This narrative served German veterans well. It explained their defeat. They had better equipment but were overwhelmed by numbers. It was comforting to believe that German engineering was superior, even if German logistics and strategy were not. The narrative also served American purposes. It justified the post-war military budget. If American equipment had been inferior, clearly more money needed to be spent on the next generation of tanks. The M26 Pershing, M46 Patton, M47, M48, M60. Each generation was described as finally catching up to German standards. The institutional narrative required that German tanks be superior, because otherwise, why had the war been so difficult? But the statistics tell a different story. American tank units achieved roughly equal kill ratios against German armor throughout the war. In specific battles where American commanders employed aggressive close-range tactics, American units achieved decisive victories, despite supposed German equipment superiority. The Sherman wasn't the best tank of World War II, but it was good enough. Combined with superior doctrine, training, and leadership, good enough was sufficient. The lesson from Aracourt wasn't that close-range tactics were always correct. They weren't. In open terrain with good visibility and no cover, attacking German armor at close range was still dangerous. But in the restricted terrain of Western Europe, the bocage, the forests, the villages' close-range tactics were often the best option. And American tankers who understood this survived more often than those who didn't. The broader lesson was about institutional learning. The army eventually figured out that aggressive tactics worked better than defensive ones, but it took months of combat and thousands of casualties to change doctrine. Meanwhile, individual commanders who deviated from doctrine based on their own battlefield experience achieved better results. The challenge for any military institution is how to accelerate that learning process, how to identify successful tactics quickly, how to disseminate those tactics widely, how to modify doctrine faster than the enemy can adapt. Modern militaries still struggle with this. Doctrine provides structure and consistency, but doctrine based on outdated assumptions produces poor results. The balance between following established procedures and adapting to battlefield reality is never easy. The commanders who get it right are the ones who understand their own capabilities and their enemy's vulnerabilities well enough to exploit gaps between what doctrine says should happen and what actually happens in combat. At 8:43 on the morning of September 19, 1944, Captain Jimmy Leach watched 8 Panthers emerge from the fog and made a decision that contradicted everything official doctrine taught. He ordered his 13 Shermans to attack. 11 minutes later, 5 Panthers were destroyed or disabled. His entire company survived. The decision to get close to enemy armor that should have killed him actually saved his life and the lives of his men. That's the irony at the heart of the Aracourt story. The tactic that seemed most dangerous was actually the safest. Running away from superior German armor made you vulnerable to their range and accuracy. Closing distance eliminated their advantages and emphasized yours. Sometimes, survival requires doing the exact opposite of what fear and doctrine tell you to do. The tankers who learned, that lesson lived. The ones who didn't. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.